it's Nate here, the video game review nerd. This is the console review for the Nintendo Gamecube as selected by you, the viewer. It's basically, as you can see, a cube. Nothing major to look at, but the specifications were actually quite impressive for the date it was released, and the fact that it's an older console using less systemized hardware than we've got now, but like I say, for the date it was released and the availability of items at the time, this was actually one of the highest spec consoles available. The specifications are, it had a 486 MHz IBM Gecko PowerPC CPU. It was a microprocessor which basically gave it an AI. It allowed it to run micro DVDs like this, a lot smaller than regular CDs and discs, but as it had smaller loading tray, you actually couldn't view DVDs or CDs on it. There's absolutely no space in there for anything other. So that kind of lowered the saleability, because people wanted things like the Sony PlayStation 2, where you could watch DVDs after playing 3 or 4 hours on a video game. They wanted a console that they could just leave plugged in, not have to switch over to a DVD player or a CD player. And they could just sit there with their regular control pad and just click away. The next item in it is a PowerPC 750 CXE base core. It was an add-in to the IBM Gecko PowerPC CPU, and it added a lot more power to it. Another part of this is there's roughly 50 vector instructions in this per microsecond, so you could load a lot into it. Then another part of the console, which was quite impressive, was all of them. This one is a serial port. That's the secondary serial port cover. And that was a high-speed trilinear connector. So you could plug in things like the Nintendo Gamecube player, and you could load your Game Boy Advance cartridges into it. Other specifications are 64-bit enhanced PowerPC 60 times front bit side bus to GPU chipset, had 162 MHz clock and 1.3 gigabits peak bandwidth. It had a 64 KB L1 cache, internal memory basically, and 256 KB of L2 die clock cache, so two-way associative. The internals of it were 43 MB total of non-unified RAM, so that's how it could get the games to load so quickly and precisely. It had a 24 MB MOSIS 1T SRAM. It was codenamed at the time of production Splash. And the main system RAM, it was 324 MHz, 64-bit bus, 2.7 GB of bandwidth built into it. There was a 3 MB embedded IT 1T SRAM within the flipper. It was split into 1 MB texture buffers and 2 MB frame buffers. There was a 10.4 gigabits a second texture peak bandwidth with quite a high graphics output there, and 7.6 gigabits frame buffer peak bandwidth, which is 6.2 nanoseconds latency. So as you can guess, quite a fast system. Then for connectivity like controllers and memory slots and leads in the back, you had 4 controller ports. Now the downside to this console was you could only get 2 types of controller. There was the original gamepad or joypad. This is a self-modified one. As you can see, the adapter is actually quite unusual. Sort of like a side-on D. It had 4 controller ports. Then for memory cards, there wasn't, again, a lot of choice because it was an ultra micro card. I don't actually have any around at the moment, but in a later video I'll do an update of what it looks like. It had a multi-AV analog audio video port, which is there. Not sure how clearly it's displaying. On the NTSC, the American model, it had a interlaced composite YCS video port. And this one has, as a PAL model for the UK, it only has an RGB port. There's a stereophonic port on it, which you actually have to take the back cover off for. You actually have to unscrew the bottom and then remove that plate in there. There are, as I've previously said, there are 2 serial ports. That one is, it was reserved for a broadband adapter or a modem adapter at the time. And then there was this, again, as I previously mentioned, a high-speed parallel port, again reserved for the Game Boy player. The power supply for the UK was 12 volts, it was DC at 3.25 amperes. The actual physical size of it is 11 centimeters high, 150 millimeters wide, and 161 millimeters deep, so from front to back. So 4.3 inches high, 5.9 wide, and 6.3 inches deep. Another part was, for the graphics, it was, as I say, really high quality. You could get 162 megahertz flipper. It was co-developed by Nintendo and Artex. It was incorporated by ATI, who did the processor. There were 8G, now excuse this name, 8G flops. Basically, it's a graphics format which loops out port systems. As you can tell, graphics format loops out port systems from the initials. It was, in simpleton terms, it was a beast at the time. There was a fixed function hardware transformer lighting built in, so you were getting 21 million polygons per game screen. So 648 megapixels a microsecond, which was 162 megahertz in 4 pipelines. You could get 648 megatexels per second, 648 megapixels in 1 texture unit peaked. The peak triangle performance was 20,250,000 32 pixel triangles, and they were raw per texture unit. So you were getting 337,500 triangles per frame at 60 frames per second, but strangely you were getting 675,000 triangles per frame at 30 frames per second. Another quite cool feature of it was the 8 texture layers per pass, which is why you managed to get, when you were playing things like ZooCube, which is quite an unknown game because nobody really liked it, I'm not sure why. It's basically, when it turned, you could get those tiny little glints on the screen. And there was also a plug-in which you could get where you plugged it into serial port number 1, there again, and it would allow you to use stereoscopic and anti-scopic 3D. It was really only developed for Luigi's Mansion, which went worldwide without it. It was really dropped out because 3D televisions weren't really widespread at the time it was released. And it was said that compatible display units would be ineffective for cost at the time. Another graphics chipset was the multi-textured bump mapping and reflection mapping 24-bit Z buffer. So that's a 24-bit RGB or a 32-bit RGBA color depth. And that's basically it. Oh, for audio, you had 64 channels for 16-bit 48 kilohertz, which built through to Dolby Pro Logic 2 multi-channel information code encoder within a stereophonic output. And as I was saying previously, the discs, Panasonic developed them. They were CAV mini DVD, like 8cm optical discs. So 2000 megabytes or 3.12 megabits per second transfer rate. And the load time was roughly 128 milliseconds on average. And the disc was 1.5 gigabytes capacity. And memory cards were available in different sizes. You get the 3 official sizes basically were 59 blocks, which is 4 megabits, 251 blocks, which is 16 megabits, and 1019 blocks, which was 64 megabits. There were cheaper third-party add-ons available where they could go anything up to 17 gigabytes, but that basically destroyed your port because it couldn't load it and it tried to run too much without hardware available. The controller, as I've previously shown, is a wingtip design. It's basically designed to fit into your hands like so. So if you play on it, basically your hand covers it. Well, mine do because they're quite large. And that's basically it. Also, the console came in 3 different official colours. There was the purple, which was mainstream. There was the black, which was slightly less well known, but widely available. And then there was the silver, or Bionic Crystal as it was released as. And that was available basically on special promotional purchases. This one actually cost me £149.99 because it came with 4 pads, 2 memory cards, 2 sets of leads. So obviously the AV lead, RGY, and the power pack, which I can't actually find right now, but there we go. And it was, as I say, quite a disused console because of no DVD capability, no CD capability, and very low cheats engine input. Because even Exploder, or Explorer, whatever it's called now, didn't want to go mainstream with it because, again, they didn't have a chance to use their freeloader capabilities. So they were basically saying, no, we're not going to bother. We'll make a chip we can put in, and that's as far as we're going to go. And all the chip ever did was basically just sped up your game and allowed you to use a Game Shark input, which was a completely different company, and that actually caused a few lawsuits in its time. So that's about it for the GameCube review. So for the next review, I'll leave it down to you again. I can either do PCs, PC games, or PlayStation 2 games. And thank you for watching. Rate, comment, subscribe, and I'll see you next week.